The Galactic Military Academy stood as a monument to interstellar cooperation, its crystalline spires reaching toward the stars. Within its halls, hundreds of species trained together, learning the arts of diplomacy and warfare that kept the peace across 1,000 worlds. Lisa Chen was one of only 12 humans in attendance, a rarity that made her both a curiosity and, to some, a target. She sat alone in the combat simulation lab, reviewing her scores from the morning's exercise. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface, analyzing every mistake, every missed opportunity. Humans were new to the galactic community, having joined only 5 years prior, and Lisa felt the weight of representation on her shoulders. Every failure reflected not just on her, but on her entire species. Still studying, human. The voice dripped with contempt. Lisa didn't need to look up to know who it was. Krazer, a Dravian, 7 feet of scaled muscle and arrogance. His species had been part of the academy for generations, and he never let anyone forget it. He'd made Lisa's life miserable since orientation day. Just reviewing the simulation, Lisa replied evenly, keeping her eyes on the screen. Kraz's clawed hand slammed down on the console, shattering the hologram. Your kind doesn't belong here. Weak, fragile, pathetic. You're not warriors. You're barely sentient. Lisa stood slowly, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by the alien's massive presence, but her dark eyes held steady. The admission board disagreed. The board made a mistake. Krazer leaned closer, his breath hot and rank. One, I'm going to correct it. Before Lisa could respond, he shoved her backward. She stumbled but didn't fall. Months of training had improved her balance. But Krazer wasn't finished. He grabbed her uniform collar, lifting her off the ground with one hand. Put her down, Krazer. The voice came from the doorway. Vin Diesel, real name Vin Diesel Harker. Though everyone called him by his improbable full name, stood in the entrance. He was another human, built like the ancient Earth warriors his parents had admired when they'd named him. At 6'2", with a shaved head and commanding presence, he was the opposite of Lisa in appearance but shared her determination. This doesn't concern you, Harker, Krazer growled, but he lowered Lisa to the ground. When you're bullying my classmate, it concerns me. Vin Diesel stepped into the room, his movements measured and controlled. Krazer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. 2 humans. Even better, I can teach you both a lesson about your place in this galaxy. What happened next occurred in seconds, though later Lisa would replay it in slow motion in her mind. Krazer lunged at Vin Diesel with the full force of his Dravian combat training. But Vin Diesel didn't move like a typical academy student following textbook maneuvers. He moved with a fluid brutality that spoke of Earth's darker combat tradition, styles developed not for sport or honor, but for survival. He sidestepped Krazer's charge, and his elbow connected with the Dravian's throat, a vulnerable point on every humanoid species. As Krazer gasped, Vin Diesel's fist drove into his solar plexus. The alien doubled over, and Vin Diesel's knee came up to meet his descending face. The crack echoed through the lab. Krazer collapsed, green blood streaming from his shattered nasal ridge. But something had changed in Vin Diesel's eyes, something primal and dangerous. Lisa had seen it before, in soldiers who'd seen too much combat. Her older brother had returned from the border wars with that same look. Vin Diesel dropped onto the fallen Dravian, his fists rising and falling with mechanical precision. Each blow landed with devastating accuracy. Ribs, joints, organs. He wasn't just defending himself, he was destroying a threat. Vin, stop, Lisa shouted, but he didn't hear her. The door burst open as Instructor Velkos rushed in. Having been alerted by the facility's violent sensors, the Centaurian instructor was a veteran of 3 wars and trained in 17 martial disciplines. But even he hesitated at the scene before him. Harker, stand down. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Vin Diesel's fist froze mid. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, awareness returned to his eyes. He looked down at Krazer, unconscious. Bleeding, broken, and horror replaced the battle fury on his face. He was. Vin Diesel's voice cracked as he stood, his hands trembling. Instructor Velkos activated his emergency beacon, calling for medical assistance. He looked at Lisa, who stood frozen against the console. Are you injured, Cadet Chen? She shook her head. Mutely. The instructor's eyes moved to Vin Diesel. You're confined to quarters pending investigation. Go now. As medical drones arrived to stabilize Krazer, Vin Diesel walked toward the door like a man in a dream. He paused beside Lisa. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Lisa watched him leave, understanding flooding through her. Vin Diesel hadn't just been defending her. He'd been defending himself from every bully, every tormentor, every person who'd ever told him he was less than he was. And in that moment, all his control had shattered. Instructor Velkos approached her carefully. Cadet Shen, I apologize. I should have addressed Krazar's behavior weeks ago. I hoped you would learn respect through competition rather than discipline. I was wrong. Lisa looked at the instructor, then at the unconscious Dravian, then at the doorway where Vin Diesel had disappeared. What will happen to him? That depends on many things, Velkos said quietly. But I fear I stopped it too late. For all of you. In the days that followed, the Academy would debate, investigate, and judge. But Lisa knew the truth. Some wounds went deeper than scales or skin. Some battles were fought long before the first punch was thrown, and sometimes the real damage wasn't to the body, but to the soul of the person who'd been pushed too far. Vin Diesel had saved her, but she wondered if anyone could save him from what he'd become in those terrible moments, or from what the galaxy would now see when they looked at all humans, not as weak perhaps, but as something potentially more dangerous, wounded predators who fought like they had nothing left to lose.